This is William Robinson with thefirealthair.com with Pastor Mark Swirsky. We're talking to him about his books, Chronicles of Altatan. First question, sir. What inspired you to write these books?
The books were inspired halfway out of arrogance and halfway out of inspiration. The arrogance came because I was reading a multi-volume fantasy series by a New York Times best-selling author, and the descriptions had gotten so detailed and so many characters were introduced into the novel that I was getting very frustrated. And finally, in my frustration, I said, I can do better than this. That's the arrogance. But then the inspiration came and I thought, well, why don't I? I'd like to incorporate a biblical worldview into a novel that portrays Christianity in a very positive light. And I had been strongly impressed by how Tolkien and C.S. Lewis did that, and that was kind of the beginning of the series.
Thank you. Now, next question. What helped you decide on the framework for the series? Was it always going to be fantasy, or did you have any other ideas for how these were going to come out?
It was pretty much always going to be fantasy. Fantasy and sci-fi are my two favorite genre, but with sci-fi you have to do a lot of research. With fantasy you don't have to do so much research, you create your own world. But you don't have to be scientific and know a lot of scientific information, so I chose fantasy.
Okay. Next question. Speaking of a Christian worldview, does it seem kind of hard sometimes to promote your books or have a part of the market and kind of the way the market is towards Christian or faith-based fantasy or sci-fi books?
Well, those are a couple questions in one. First, for the Christian audience, the challenge is fantasy involves swords and magic. Magic is the problem because you usually have wizards or sorcerers or other people, and the Bible talks against those things. It forbids going to sorcerers or using any kind of miraculous power apart from God. In our world, there are only two sources of supernatural power. One is God and one is Satan and his demons. So if you're not going to God, you are by fault going to the devil and his demons. And so the Bible forbids any kind of magical stuff apart from God. But in fantasy, you're creating a new world that doesn't necessarily abide by our world. And so people like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien use magic and magical systems in their fantasy, but they did not use it in a way that was occultic or demonic or anything. So one of the challenges with the Christian audience is helping them to see that you can use fantasy to promote the Lord's work. As far as the secular audience, the challenge for me is I wanted to write a story that was interesting and a page turner. I wanted to incorporate spiritual truth, but I didn't want to be preachy. And so the balance is writing a story that encompasses that biblical worldview, but that is not so overt that a secular audience would turn off to it. So that was the challenge with that audience. And I decided to market the book to a non-religious audience rather than a religious one because I wanted them to hear the message.
Right. And to answer that question, you answered the next one, which was how people of faith-based worldview would take your book, but you already answered that, so thank you. That was good to know. Now, last question is the fourth book of the Altatan series the last, or do you have other ideas up your sleeve, or is there a new series coming? How do you see it going from here?
The fourth book completes the series. Currently, I'm working on a prequel to the series. Ransom Cross is the protagonist in the series, and he has a great ancestor by the name of Galdarian Lionslayer. That is his ancestor who allows Ransom to be in the line of the king. And I'm doing a story on Galdarian, and Galdarian is essentially the David figure. So I've always been intrigued by David. How is it that a man who is supposedly a man after God's own heart can do such incredibly sinful things, some really terrible things in his life? And so in that novel, I'm trying to answer that question. How is it that Galderian can both be a man who really seeks God and who God really loves, and yet do some really horrible things? So that's what I'm working on now.
Well, thanks for your time, Pastor, and I hope the rest of your show goes well.
Thank you.